Hello everybody and welcome to this YNGB webinar on Canopy Management. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jo Caldroy and YNGB's Operation Manager. I would like to very briefly introduce our two speakers, but before I do that, I'd just like to talk you through the Q&A system. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A symbol, and you type your question into there, and then when we get to the Q&A session a little bit later, I'll be able to read out the question to our two speakers who will be staying on as panelists to answer your questions. And also, I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the YNGB website in a few days' time. So let's move on, and I will introduce our two speakers. So we have Dr. Patty Skinkis, who is Professor and Viticulture Extension Specialist at Oregon State University, and also Duncan McNeil, who's a viticulturist and consultant from here in the UK. I will now hand over swiftly to Patty. Thank you, and I'll disappear into the background.
So thank you. As Jo mentioned, I'm Patty Skinkis. I am a professor at Oregon State University, where I do teaching, research, and extension. My largest component of the work that I do is outreach to the Oregon wine grape industry. And I do a lot of applied research that helps address production questions that we have in the state, and I'm really pleased to be able to share a big chunk of my research program with you in a brief 15 minutes or so. Hopefully it'll be distributed over that time. I'm summarizing a number of ways that we've worked with Canopy Management in Oregon's Willamette Valley specifically. And to give you an idea of where we're located, many Americans aren't even sure where Oregon is, I think, sometimes. But we have a map here of the US with the purple dots indicating where we have wineries throughout the US. And of course, the largest percentage of wineries are on the West Coast, and Oregon is in the Pacific Northwest. So the outline of the state of Oregon is here, and much of our production regions are on the west coast of, or western region of the state. And here's just a close-up of the state. I'm located in Corvallis, Oregon, which is the main campus of Oregon State University, and it's in about the middle section of the Willamette Valley, the black area here. And in this region, we do have both warm, arid regions of the state, and in the green and the blue areas, but most of our state in the black and purple. Those production regions are cool areas. We focus mainly on Pinot Noir. So 69% of the total acreage in the state is in the Willamette Valley, and 80% of that is Pinot Noir. We do have lesser amounts of Pinot Gris and Chardonnay. So those are top 3 grape varieties that we grow. The majority of what we produce is for table wines, but we do have a percentage of production, probably about 15 to 20%, that is for sparkling wine production, which is solely in the Willamette Valley. So that's where we're located. And of course, being that I'm located in the Willamette Valley, majority of my research is done there. And to give you an idea of how cool our climate is, we are usually hovering around 1,200 heat units, and that's in degrees Celsius. So during the growing season, we get about 1,300 heat units. Long-term average is closer to 1,200, but more recently in the past 10 to 15 years, we've been warmer. Annually, we have about 1,400 heat units. We also are pretty wet during the winter months, so anywhere from about November through May is our wettest seasons. But during the growing season, April to October, we have only about 356 millimeters of rain during that time point, but total during the year is over 1,000. So pretty wet region. And we also have high water holding capacity in our soils. They tend to be of volcanic or sedimentary origin, and they do have a high water holding capacity, but also good drainage. So this is what most of our vineyards look like, and the amount of growth that we get, very high vigor. I like to say we live in a very luxurious climate for grapevines. They don't really have to stress out very much. We have a lot of lateral growth. We hedge at least 2 times. In some vineyards, it's 3 to 5 times that we're hedging if they're very vigorous. And this is a typical vineyard before it's been hedged. We are mostly vertically shoot positioned Guyot systems. And I would say most of our spacings are pretty moderate. So vine spacing is usually around 1.5 meters, and then row spacing is about 2 or a little bit over 2 meters. But we have variations on that. So most of our canopy management focuses largely on dealing with that amount of vigor. And unfortunately, most of our practical management is in reducing canopy density and modifying the microclimate and under those situations. But we are really trying to get growers to look at how they manage the whole system to be able to achieve better vine balance. So trying to decrease canopy size and getting a better balance with not having too much growth. So the picture here is actually of a vineyard that has pretty good balance. It doesn't have to be hedged a whole bunch of times, but this is rather atypical for our region to get to this stage. And throughout my research program, and I'm going to talk about projects that today that focused on leaf removal and cluster thinning. Some people might argue that cluster thinning isn't part of canopy management, but really I think it's a big component of what we do, and it is part of the canopy, so we're going to talk about that. But then also, are there ways that we can reduce the amount of corrective measures that we do in the vineyard? Because it'll affect the bottom line and vineyard economics overall. So that'll be the last component I talk about. So I'll jump right into the first set of studies that we did here in Oregon. Leaf removal is very commonly done, in part to remove leaves in that fruit zone and expose that cluster zones, particularly in the morning sun side, so that we're not getting too much heat load on the west side of the canopy. Typically we're north-south oriented rows. And this is best done in high canopy or high density canopies, just to ensure that we're getting good spray coverage for disease control, but also improving our fruit quality. And when I first came to Oregon, a lot of growers were doing leaf pulling very late, pretty much veraison or later. And we were trying to get them to do this much earlier so that we could get better color development, because a lot of our Pinot Noirs were pretty lightly colored. And we were trying to encourage them to do pre-bloom to fruit set time zone or time frame. And many of them were very afraid of doing that, thought they would lose all of their crop if they did that. And we found that that was actually a very beneficial time to do that. And we also found that piece size to bunch closure is also very effective, but we discourage any later season leaf removal, so veraison or later, especially if there had not been any leaf removal done prior to that point. Typically, we have more potential for sunburning later in the season, and as well as desiccation of our berries if we wait until that late. So here's a picture of a high vigor vineyard that has canopy leaf removal in the cluster zone on the east side only. This is an afternoon picture, so you can see the sunlight coming through. On the west side, the leaves are maintained to prevent any overexposure of those clusters. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is this is mechanically leaf pulled. And a lot of our growers like to open up a larger portion of that canopy, not only for exposure of the clusters, but for harvest. So they can run through once with leaf removal rather than having to do a very small area of the canopy. So the research that we did over a period of about 4 years in a whole bunch of different vineyards, but I'll showcase data from 2 vineyards today. We looked at really early season leaf removal. So we pulled pre-bloom when flowers were just beginning to separate, at bloom time, the BB to pea size stage, and then at bunch closure. And then we compared that in these vineyards to no leaf pulling at all. This was all done in just Pinot Noir. We didn't do it in any other variety. And we pulled 100% of the leaves. So when I say 100% of leaves, that means in the cluster zone only. So that was 5 to 7 leaves per shoot. So this would have been the earliest stage that we pulled leaves. And that looks pretty drastic when we pull off those leaves off. So only maybe the 1 or 2 recently expanded leaves were left on the plant. And we were really concerned at that stage we would lose a lot of fruit set. But we did it just to kind of bookend what our parameters were for leaf removal. And we did find that doing that drastic leaf removal did reduce set, but only by about 10 to 20%, depending on year. So we had probably enough carbohydrates in reserves to allow the flower to develop rather normally. And so we found that pre-bloom leaf removal was pretty effective, and as much as any other time point of leaf removal. And the reason somebody would want to do it is so that we could potentially increase disease control, as well as getting better color development and possibly more phenolics. So here's a picture of a canopy that had 100% leaf removal. This is at harvest. And this is a close-up of those clusters. This was in a hot year, and many of our growers still are very reticent to do this because they're afraid they're going to have sunburn. And this is the fruit. In 2018, warm, dry season, we had no sunburning at all. So just an example of how well it can work. But we did look specifically at powdery mildew and botrytis infections in the clusters to see whether leaf removal would help us out in reducing infection. And these were in commercial vineyards that were organically managed. We have no organic botryticide to use in the States, so they really rely on early season leaf removal. And we found that basically if you pulled leaves at any time point, it decreased the percent of botrytis. And this is again in commercial vineyards, a warm vineyard. That vineyard 1 on top is a warm vineyard. Vineyard 2 is a cooler vineyard based on their elevation and the time point in the year that they harvest. They're about 2 weeks apart in terms of bloom time as well as harvest. And we found that basically if they do their typical fungicide regime, mainly focused on powdery mildew, and using leaf removal for botrytis, they were able to reduce their botrytis incidence, whether it was done pre-bloom or bunch closure. So it really didn't matter. And of course, this was 100% of that cluster zone being removed and totally open. So that was a benefit. So then a lot of growers would say, well, I'll just stick to my later time point. Why would I want to use an early bloom time point for 100% fruit exposure? And we found that there was, in fact, higher anthocyanins. So this is between those same 2 sites that we had. The bloom time point had a higher amount of anthocyanin specifically than the later stages, and certainly more than the control. And it really didn't change the type of anthocyanin or the composition of those anthocyanins. It just was the total amount was higher. So that's the number one reason that people do that. Also, many growers feel like they have a better opportunity to control disease by opening their cluster zone earlier and getting better spray coverage at that time. So the next step in that work was to test out different types or different levels of leaf removal. So instead of just 100%, which seemed pretty drastic for many growers, we decided to look at 50% of the leaves being removed, 100% no leaves removed, and of course the industry standard, which is east side cluster zone removal only. And we compared that across 3 different growing seasons. We actually had to shift to a different vineyard in 2012. And what we found was that if we did not pull leaves at all, we had about a 21 to 45% lower sunlight exposure in the cluster zone. So that's this dark green bar here. In comparison to the other leaf pull treatments, the 100, the 50, and the industry standard, we found it obviously an increase in sunlight exposure, but there was much a greater impact of the 100% leaf removal in the highest density vineyards. So it was both high density, so close fine spacing, and very high vigor. So we saw a much greater impact of the 100% leaf removal versus our moderate vigor vineyard that we used in 2012. It didn't matter if you used 50% or 100% leaf removal, the amount of exposure of the cluster zone was about the same, largely because they just didn't have so much upper canopy occlusion of light. So we found that we wouldn't have to go that extreme for a moderate density or moderate vigor vineyard. So in removing leaves at those different levels, we wondered if it would impact basic ripeness. And we found that basically whether you pulled leaves or not, it didn't really impact the brick's pH or titratable acidity. We also found no impact on total anthocyanin, tannin, or phenolic, unlike our prior study. But what we did find is that the more we increased sunlight exposure to our clusters, we increased certain composition of our anthocyanins. So we saw a higher pituitin and melvidin, which could potentially shift the colors more to a bluish or purple, a darker purple, than a lighter purple. And we also saw an increase in beta-damascenone, which is an aromatic compound that's found in Pinot Noir that gives it a characteristic fruity aroma that we find desirable for Pinot Noir, somewhat of like a blackberry aroma. And what we found specifically is where we increased our sunlight, and this was measured in the cluster zone, we also increased beta-damascenone. And most interesting in this study was that the greater impact was in our cooler year, where we had the highest canopy density. And we also did that work in 2011 in the same vineyard, and the impacts were less. And it could be just due to seasonal variation. But overall, in our moderate vigor vineyard, we just didn't see as much of an impact by leaf removal probably because we already had ambient light coming in, irrespective of any canopy leaf removal that we did. So if you have the very high density vineyards, it's better to do a more intense leaf removal so that you can get possibly better aromatic development as well as color. So the last studies we did on leaf removal were just comparing hand versus mechanical. So all of the studies I talked about previously were done only with hand leaf removal to control how much we were removing. But in this case, growers really wanted to know, can we do this mechanically to help us reduce the amount of our resources, economics? Certainly it's much cheaper to mechanically leaf pull. And we did this at bloom, pea size, and bunch closure, and we did both sides of the canopy, as well as a bunch closure where we did only east side only, which was more like the industry standard. And we did this in a very cool wet season. So this is a picture of what the leaf removal looked like. This was at the bloom time point. Before leafing is on the left, mechanical is in the middle, and hand is on the right. Certainly you can always get better leaf removal if you do it by hand. And the small plots that we use, we certainly were doing it not all day with labor crews, so it may not always look this neat even with labor crews if you're trying to get through at a certain pace. But by doing mechanical leaf removal versus hand, we basically had no effect on ripening and no effect on anthocyanins, phenolics, or tannins. We did see that if you did the hand leaf removal at bunch closure, we did have a 10% lower botrytis incidence. But when we looked at the percentage of berries that had botrytis, whether it was mechanical or hand leaf pulled, we saw no difference at harvest. So there was really no reason to say that mechanical leaf removal could not be used or be as effective as hand leaf removal in our studies. And many growers use this work and have now implemented more mechanical leafing. About 50% of our producers are still using hand, but there's a lot more mechanical leafing going on here as a result of some of this local work. So I'm going to hand it over to Duncan for him to talk about local practices and any other information he wants to share on leaf removal.
Thank you, Patty. That's been very, very interesting. And the first thing I'd like to say is that based on our experiences, I agree with almost everything that you've had to say. It's been quite surprising how much I'd agree with. Now let me just bring up my PowerPoint. Okay. Now. Here we go. So I would say, based on my experiences over the last 10 to 15 years growing grapes in the UK, that fruit zone leaf stripping is definitely become the cornerstone of botrytis, bunch rot control and quality. And what has also become evident, one moment, I just time myself. What has also become evident, certainly in the last 5 years, is that as our climate is warming up, we're seeing the key growth stages are occurring earlier. So that's bud burst is occurring earlier. Flowering is certainly occurring earlier. When I came back to the UK in 2006, flowering would be occurring in the last week of June or the beginning of July. And what we would say now, based on the last 6 to 7 years, the average date for flowering, certainly in East Anglia, where I'm practicing, is between the 12th and the 15th of June. So that's certainly come forward by 7 to 10 days. And that's significant. And it's taken us into an area where we are able to grow Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and also, as Patty says, in Oregon, we're also able to grow some Pinot Gris for the production of high quality still wines in a Burgundian style. Now, in order to do that, leaf stripping has become, as I say, a cornerstone of what we do. And very interesting to listen to the studies that Patty's carried out. We find exactly the same. We carry out our de-leafing now in the middle of bloom. In the early years, we used to do it at pea size, but based on research and our own experiences, we found out that exactly as you had said, during the middle of bloom, we were getting a reduction in bunch size, a marginal reduction in yield, but that was in some cases desired, and in certainly getting an improvement in botrytis control. But just to go through these numbers that I have got here, the manual cost of leaf stripping in the UK is coming out to about £350 an acre. Now that is just over 10% of the annual growing cost for grapes. We're looking at about £3,200, £3,300 an acre. So you're just over 10% of the growing cost. So whilst it's a practice that helps to minimise the use of pesticides, improve bunch rot control, certainly improve the control of powdery mildew, it really is putting a strain on production costs. Now, 3 years ago, I invested in a mechanical leaf stripper, and it's paid itself off within 2 years. You can justify one with an acreage as small as 20 acres. It'll pay itself off. We actually cover an area of 40 acres with our single-sided leaf stripping machine. And once the machine cost is paid off, you can get that cost down to about £50 an acre. So it's a huge, huge saving. And I would agree that the results are 95% as thorough as hand leaf stripping. One of the, it sounds silly to say, but one of the almost unexpected side effects of leaf stripping, whether we do it by hand or by machine, is a reduction in our harvest costs by up to 30%. We have found, certainly in red grapes, where you have a clean crop of 8 to 10 tonne to the hectare, a fully leaf stripped canopy, and that means fully leaf stripped on one side, can enable a picker to harvest up to 1,000 kilos a day. And that's that's way above the industry standard, and that is down to just ease of access to the grapes. There's a slide of our brand new leaf stripping machine on a 20-year-old tractor. But it's a fairly simple machine. Requires an oil flow of about 35 litres per minute. It's simply a fan with 2 rollers, which runs up alongside the canopy there, and sucks the leaves in and blows them out the front. Now, at this stage, I'm going to attempt to show you a video clip of this leaf stripper in action. So bear with me here. And hopefully this is going to work. I shall now go back to the leaf stripping part of my presentation. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too loud for everybody, but that's just to show you the machine in action there. Oh, I'm having some technical problems here. I don't appear to be able to move forward with my presentation. One moment.
Duncan, let me know if you need any help.
Yeah, here we go. Right, I'm going to try and move on with the presentation again now. It won't seem to let me move off this slide.
Try using the cursor rather than the mouse, pushing down.
I am. I'm going to come out of it, and I'm going to, right, where are we here? Bear with me. So I'll screen share again. I'll go back to the Canopy Management webinar. I'm going to share that again. Oh, I think, Joe, I need to go back to slide number 1. Here we go. This is what you described earlier.
Yeah. sometimes is.
There we go. Right, now that's it again. Here we go. So apologies for that, guys. So on to the specification of leaf stripping. Whilst it was very interesting to see, yeah, I concurred with almost everything that Patty had said about their experiences in Oregon. Where we have had success in the UK is actually with stripping on the opposite side. Those costs of £350 an acre were for stripping on one side. And whilst that stripping has been done, 100% of the leaves have been taken off on the western side, but with the manual labourers being encouraged to reach through and take off some of the leaves on the eastern side of the canopy as well. And what had driven me to concentrate on the western side of the canopy was the coolness of the climate and our relative lack of solar radiation and of growing degree days. We're looking at the moment at an average of about 1,000 growing degree days in the warmest parts of the UK, which is just about creeping into the region where we can start to look at making good still wines from Chardonnay, Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, but it is certainly very challenging. And the rationale for stripping on the western side for the later ripening varieties, and by that I mean Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, is that the afternoon sun is more intense and will therefore get more heat onto the grapes. And one of the biggest challenges in growing grapes for still Burgundian wines in the UK is high acidity levels, and principally a higher ratio of malic acid to tartaric acid than we would ideally like. A lot of the time, if you're harvesting Pinot Noir, for example, and it's coming in at 11 or 12 grams per litre of titratable acidity, up to 5 grams of that can be malic acid. And that's really, really too high, certainly too high for still wines. So what we found is by getting that afternoon sun onto the grapes, we're able to get those malic acid levels down, in some cases, down as low as 3 grams per litre. And that's really softening out the malic. And for those of you that are not aware, the two main acidities within grape berries, you've got malic acid, which is the bitter, sour acidity, and tartaric being the smoother acidity that's not quite so sour. So if we can reduce that ratio of malic versus tartaric, then that's certainly going to benefit the wines. Now, for the earlier ripening varieties, we would indeed strip on the eastern side as opposed to the western side. And for that, we're talking about Bacchus, Ortega, Solaris. For the reds, you'd be looking at Rondo or Frühburgunder, perhaps. And the reason for that, and we've certainly found this in the last 5 years, so we're looking at 2016, 17 and 18, having leaf stripped these varieties on the western side, we were getting acidity levels that were going down too low. One good example would be Bacchus in 2017. We were down at 5.8 grams per litre acidity, and the wines that were resulting from those grapes were certainly lacking in a bit of backbone, lacking in structure. So, and again, this is a fairly recent phenomenon that we have realised with these earlier ripening varieties that we actually can lose too much acidity in the earlier ripening varieties if we expose them to the afternoon sun. Another issue that has become much more topical in the last 3 to 4 years is the spotted wing Drosophila fruit fly, and that has come up from southern Europe, and it's been present in the UK in UK vineyards since 2015. And we've had problems with Frühburgunder or Pinot Noir Précoce, Dornfelder, Rondo, I haven't put in the slide there, and Pinot Meunier. Now, there are a number of insecticides which are very efficient at reducing the rate of the pest and reducing the rate of crop loss, but I'd say an essential part of the program to control spotted wing Drosophila is to make sure that there is as little shade as possible in the fruiting zone, and therefore with these varieties we need to strip the leaves away on both sides, because it's been via research, it's been discovered that the female likes to lay her eggs in shady and almost damp conditions. So if we can strip all of the leaves away on these early ripening varieties, we found that's been extremely effective at not allowing a habitat to develop which is conducive for the fly to lay her eggs. The optimum time for leaf stripping that we have found, I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but the absolute latest time, I should say, is before bunch closure, because we find that the second botryticide application that we tend to make is the pre-bunch closure spray, and it's it improves the deposition of the fungicide if we've done a leaf stripping pass before then. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experience with the timings of leaf stripping now, and this is again concurs with exactly what they have found in Oregon. This is definitely my preferred timing. The growth stage that we're at the moment is coming up to peppercorn-sized berries, and we completed our leaf stripping last week. So we started it at 50% capful. And we aim to, certainly on the Chardonnay, on the Pinot Meunier, and on the compact clones of Pinot Noir, we want to get our leaf stripping done before flowering has completed. For me, as a grape grower in the UK, and as a grower who's now trying more to grow high quality grapes for still wines, so grapes with higher levels of sugar, looking to 90, even 95 Ursula. So we're talking between 12.5 and 13.5 potential alcohol, and looking to get the acidity levels as low as possible. The secret to growing high quality grapes is being able to delay your harvest as long as you possibly can. Now, what stops you delaying your harvest in a climate like the UK is normally pressure from botrytis and other bunch rots. Bunch rots creeping in, you're under pressure to harvest the fruit. So how do we do that? Well, what I have learned is that fungicides for botrytis are not the best method of control. Again, I agree exactly what was said by Patty earlier on. It's canopy management, specifically, creating a smaller berry, a less compacted bunch, and being able to stop the berry skin from splitting. That is the best tool in our armor to prevent botrytis bunch rot. Over the last 3 years, we've only made 2 applications of botrytis pesticides, and the last one of those has been the pre-bunch closure, and that means it's been in July. Last year, 2019, we had the wettest harvest period that we've had for many, many years. Our latest application of a botrytis fungicide was on the 30th or 31st of July, and we did not have any rotten grapes. And this was down to canopy management techniques, principally stripping the leaves off in mid-flowering. What happens within the grapevine, if you strip the leaf off that's in front of the bunch of grapes, the process of cell division, which is where the berry starts to increase in size immediately after fruit set, that process is interrupted for 10 to 12 days. And that has a very, very significant effect. It enables the berries to stay smaller. It does result in a reduction in yield, and we have found that that's been up to 15%. But again, if we're looking to grow grapes of a high quality, we'll come on to this later on, that yield management is key. Anyway, what we also found, and I have garnered this information through research, is that exposing the berries from day one of being fertilized results in an increased development of a compound called carotenoids in the skin cells. And what the carotenoids do, and human beings make carotenoids in their skin cells also, and it gives the skin cells more elasticity, and it makes them therefore more robust. And this all has to do with stopping your berry skins from splitting in October when they're reaching full ripeness. So by defoliating mid-flowering, we're getting the carotenoid development in the skins, which is making them more elastic and robust, looser bunches, better pesticide deposition, a reduction in berry acidity. And I saw the question come up earlier on from Ben Brown there, and yeah, categorically we have found that we're able to reduce the levels of malic acid in our fruit if we leaf strip, particularly on the western side of the canopy, and reduced harvest costs. I'll try and hurry up now because I'm taking time up here. The later you leaf strip, in my experience, the less benefit you get. So a moderate timing for leaf stripping, in my opinion, would be pea-sized berries. I personally find this to be too late. No reduction in berry size, almost no reduction in yield. There will be a reduction in berry acidity. And again, as you said, at this stage, the potential for sunburn. I would liken this to a 44-year-old man, possibly like myself, putting short trousers on for the first time when he goes on holiday to Spain. If your skin has not been exposed to the sun for the first part of your life, then very, very quickly your skin is going to react by becoming sunburned. If you have had sun on your skin from the very early stage of your life, then your skin is going to build up a tolerance to the sun, and it is exactly the same principle for grape berry skins. So the later that you de-leaf in the fruit zone, the greater the risk of sunburn for that reason. And late leaf stripping, I completely agree with Patty. By veraison, it would almost be undesirable. Very minimal reduction in acidity, very high risk of sunburn, and all you're really doing is getting a reduction in your harvesting costs. A couple of shots here. This is a block of Pinot Noir and a vineyard in Essex, and that's been de-leafed. As you can see, they're right in the middle of flowering, 100% defoliation on the western side of the canopy. And again, the vineyard owners get a bit of a shock when they see this, but again, it's really reassuring to hear Patty's research that tends to concur with the experience that we have had. There's been no reduction in sugars, a minor reduction in yield, but far better control of bunch rot. And this was the best result we have had to date. Yeah, crop thinned. The yield reduction took the yield reduction as a result of having defoliated early took the yield down to 2.2 tonne to the acre, which is just over 5 tonne to the hectare. Obviously, this was in 2018, but we managed to come out with a potential alcohol of over 13%, and that's a 2018 wine that will be released later on this year, and we're really excited about the quality of this wine. So I'm going to hand back over to Patty now. Okay. Oh, Patty, I think you need to unmute.
There we go. So now I'm going to switch gears over to yield management and some studies that we have done there. Like Duncan had said, that crop thinning is always a central focus of premium wine production. And in Oregon, our biggest focus is on Pinot Noir production, and specifically high-end Pinot Noir. And many of the reasons that people have done cluster thinning for years has mainly been because of our cool climate. We want to hasten ripening, and we want to increase fruit quality. And really there's the understanding that we really have to push our harvest forward or earlier, because we are usually trying to work around fall rains that we're trying to avoid. And typically the practices are that we reduce yield by anywhere from 25 to 50%. And this has usually cost us quite a bit of money on an acre basis. It's about $700 to $800 US. So I calculated that for what it would be per hectare for you guys. Basically, this is usually more than one pass. Typically, growers are doing at least 2 passes. And what we found in a survey of our industry is that about 89% of the industry does cluster thinning. And for Pinot Noir, we found that 67% were focusing on a very specific target of 2 to 2.75 tons per acre. And I did some initial research in both the Willamette Valley and our Southern Oregon region, where we looked at what our yield should be by doing cluster thinning studies over a course of 3 seasons, and came up with very similar findings from our cooler climate as our warm climate, and we found very little impact of doing our cluster thinning. From that work, when we shared the work about cluster thinning, we were working with different time points. We started early in the season, figuring that if we cluster thinned at bloom, and then also did maybe the pea-size stage, the leg phase stage, veraison time point, we wanted to see what was the best time point and how much. And what we found was it really didn't matter when we crop thinned. It basically was more about how much. And in a very high yielding year, we could increase our bricks as expected by crop thinning more. But we found that early season cluster thinning was actually not very good because it caused more vigor. We shared this information with the industry. We showed how minor the impacts were actually from our cluster thinning, and many growers just basically said, we don't believe you. We think that this is a special case scenario for those vineyards, which were commercial vineyards, and those seasons. So I said, well, fair enough. Certainly, I can understand their hesitancy to try new yields when that is the #1 way that they quantified quality. You know, everybody's contract said they had to have it in this narrow range. And so we thought, let's get more people involved in this project to test out crop levels in many more vineyards and make wines at a larger scale than our small scale wine production in our research winery. So we set out to engage the industry on a very large crop load project over the course of 10 years. And we helped engage growers on doing the project directly on site. Our goal in the end of this 10 years is to come up with guidelines to help balance quality and production goals along with what a season provides. So we can look back at the heat units from those years and say, okay, we might want to adjust yields to a certain level in a given year. So these are the vineyards that have been involved in the project over the last 9 years, we're in year 9 right now of the project. It's actively still going. We've had 25 companies take part. We have between 10 and 15 vineyards that take part in this study each year. And this work is done directly on site with at least 1 to 3 acres of their vineyard dedicated to the project. And they make between 1 to 1.5 ton fermenters with the fruit for each crop level. They could choose up 2 or more crop levels that they replicate on site. So all of the data we get from the growers, they collect, they follow protocols we give them, they produce the wines, they give the data to me, I analyze it statistically, we do compositional analysis of the fruit in my lab, and then we do sensory analysis for them with an expert wine panel. And there's a lot of data. I'm not going to show all of the data today because we've got a lot of years and a lot of vineyards of data. And the results are basically, we did reduce crop level, which is no surprise by crop thinning. Usually we're doing a cluster per shoot thinning level. And this is the last 8 years of data for in kilograms per meter for the different crop levels. The lowest being a half cluster per shoot, which is a 1-0-1-0 cluster thinning regime, 1 cluster, 1.5, which is a 1-2-1-2 cluster thinning regime, 2 clusters per shoot, no thinning at all, and then just an average of all treatments. And we have about a 57% reduction if we do a half cluster per shoot, a 38% reduction in crop level with a 1 cluster per shoot, 23% crop reduction if we do 1.5, and a 12%, not very much crop reduction at all. If we do a 2 cluster per shoot, it's about the same as no thinning. So we are reducing our crop levels, and basically each year that we do this analysis, it actually is underwhelming, the lack of differences we have. Much to our surprise and many of the producers' surprise, there's very few to no differences at all in fruit composition. Now, all of our thinning was done at leg phase, so about 50 days post bloom. That's the standard time point that cluster thinning is done in our industry here. And there's very few differences based on a given site, but if we look at differences, the differences are basically between site, and the site differences are what are more different than our yield effect. And we have no evidence of overcropping stress to date, and that is indicated by looking at vine nutrient status as well as our pruning weights. And we've also had no requirements of increased input, so they haven't had to fertilize heavier or add water, irrigate heavier. Most of our sites are not irrigated for this project. From a wine sensory standpoint, the yield did not affect any characteristics, whether it was color, aroma, or mouthfeel. Again, many of winemakers were actually disappointed in that result. They thought for sure we would see more differences, but you really can't tell differences in most of the production sites. Even own producers of their own wines, if they're tasted blind, can't tell the differences. And most growers have taken away from this study a greater expectation of yield for their vineyards, so they know that they can have higher yield and maintain quality. Most will admit they don't like to leave a full crop on their vines. They still reduce their crop, but they've gone towards the about a 20% or 15 to 20% reduction, basically doing the 1-2-1-2 or 1.5 clusters per shoot is maintained on the vine. And most of them said they've actually benefited economically from this because it decreased the cost of goods sold. So this has been a really informative study. There's a lot of data I could share, but these are the main takeaways from the project. Surprisingly, few differences in yield, but these are also vineyards that are well managed. They have good canopy management practices in place, and that might be a bigger factor in the quality than the yield itself. So now I'll switch it over to Duncan for him to comment on specific practices there.
Thanks, Patty. I'll just bring back up my slideshow again. Hold on one moment, sorry. Stop share. One moment. I think I'm having problems with the presentation here. Joe, I think I need to go, for some reason, I need to go back to slide number 1 again. Bear with me. Right, I'll share screen. One moment. I have to go back to the start. Here we go. Right, I'll just go through this again. What I will say immediately, when Patty had identified a yield area of between 2 and 2.5, well, 2.75 tonnes to the acre, it sounds as though the research that they've done has shown that not necessarily to be beneficial. But I will say that where in our circumstances, that has been beneficial. It's our range of yield for producing high quality still wines from Burgundian varieties, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, has been exactly that, 2 to 2.5 tonnes to the acre. As I say, we do have a slightly cooler growing season. We're racking up a maximum 1,000 growing degree days, and I have certainly found out to my cost in previous years that allowing the yields to go higher to, if we say, to between 3 and 4 tonnes an acre, the quality of the fruit intensity, the sugar accumulation, the physiological ripeness, it just doesn't seem to be achieved. So we have, not necessarily in a scientific way, but we certainly have learned that quite significant crop thinning will be necessary if we're going to grow good quality, certainly Pinot Noir, Chardonnay grapes in the UK. So that's one of the methods that we use there, shoulder thinning. That's certainly something that we have found has been important. Anyway, I'll start on a general note. So yeah, fruit thinning. And okay, so how do you thin fruit? There are a number of different ways of reducing the level of your crop, and the leaf removal that we discussed earlier is certainly one of those. You know, an aggressive leaf removal can result in a much lighter bunch. But if we talk about bunch removal, we tend to go through at one pass, and it's been relatively quick, and it looks to have been considerably cheaper. We're talking about £100 an acre, so maybe £250 a hectare for a bunch thin. The timing, I agree absolutely with what Patty had said. Thinning the bunches out any time before bunch closure appears to result in excessive vigour, not only in the canopy, but in the bunches that remain. We find that the bunches that remain, if we thin the fruit out too early in the season, so at fruit set or even pea size, the remaining bunches, they swell up too much. They become too compact, and that leads us into trouble with bunch rot during the harvest period, because we have exactly the same problem that you described. We are harvesting late. We're sort of middle of October for still wine, middle to the end of October, and as you say, you're running into harvest rains where the skins are very delicate and very prone to splitting. So we need to maintain a nice loose bunch structure to enable us to stop our skins from splitting. And I have found in practice over the previous few years that early veraison has been the most practical time to carry out thinning, and that has been because we're executing that with a relatively unskilled labour crew. We have Eastern European labour forces, and we need to give them an easy to understand instruction. And if we go in at early veraison, whether that's with red or white grapes, it's easy for even an untrained eye to identify the parts of the bunch or the bunches which are lagging behind with veraison. And even with this being relatively late, I have found, exactly as you have said, that it still enables a good ripening. The timing is less important than the amount of fruit that has been removed. We've certainly found the same thing, and you know, up until recently, our bunch thinning has been restricted to removing shoulder bunches or the third bunches on a shoot. But as time's gone by, we've realised that we need to come down to, I would say, between 5 and 6 tonnes to the hectare, so 2 to 2.5 tonnes an acre. Obviously, it all depends on your target wine style, and I realise not everybody in the UK is looking to grow, you know, premium still wines from their you know, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, grape varieties. And so, if you're growing for sparkling, I'd certainly say acidity levels are less of an issue. Higher acidity levels and accumulated sugar levels are also less of an issue. So the requirement for crop thinning, I would say, would without a doubt be less. But the target wine style is going to define your required sugar levels, your titratable acidity levels, and the flavour intensity that you're looking for. So, as I say, we're looking for a maximum of 6 tonnes to the hectare. And again, this was something I was always taught when I worked in my early days in Central Otago in New Zealand, which was also about premium Pinot Noir. And they had also found that 5 to 6 tonnes to the hectare seemed to be the sweet spot for achieving the optimum levels of ripeness. I would say, yeah, yield reduction is absolutely crucial for you know, achieving quality grapes for making English still wine. Calculation, if we're looking for 6 tonnes to the hectare maximum, a lot of our vine densities are between 2 to 2.4 metre alleyway width and 1 metre to 1.2 in the row. So if we say something like 4,500 vines to the hectare, now 6,000 kilos a hectare divided by 4,500 vines leaves you requiring 1.3 to 1.5 kilos of vine in order to achieve your 6 tonnes to the hectare. Depending on the clones that you're growing and the growing season that you've had, average bunch weights can be anywhere between 130, 180 grams per bunch. Very crudely speaking, that leaves you with a target bunch number per vine of between 8 and 11. And exactly as Patty had said in her previous presentation, we're now considering 1 bunch per shoot or 1.5 bunches per shoot, exactly the same. It's very, very reassuring to hear that. So yeah, between 8 and 11 bunches per vine. So depending on the shoot numbers that you have, if we are looking for still, you know, for premium still wines, that's where we're looking for. That's that section finished. So I'm going to hand back over to Patty now.
Okay, so it's great to hear the similarities in what you're finding with yield management, because yeah, we do this work and then there's a lot of details to it, but and a lot of variability between vineyards, but it's neat to see some synergies between regions. So the last portion I want to wrap up with, and I know we're coming close on time, and this will be really brief, but I think it's really critical in cool climate regions to talk about how can we manage vine balance. So we are always dealing with a lot of canopy management. Can we reduce the amount that we are having to do by balancing that vine better? And we've done a number of vineyard floor management research studies here in Oregon because we don't irrigate. I mean, some sites we do, but mostly we are concerned about having enough devigoration of our vines, either through managing soil moisture or through nutrition. So there was a study that I organized. First study I did here in Oregon was looking at ways to manage the vineyard floor. Originally, the growers basically said, we want you to do this study, and they looked at it very differently than I did. They looked at it as a way to just figure out which way made the best wine. And I was thinking, which way is the best way to reduce vine vigor, which will hopefully improve fruit and wine quality. So this study was done over a course of 9 years. It had 3 phases. And basically the main thing over the 3 phases was we did a very simple vineyard floor management design where we looked at tilling the alleyways between vine rows, or leaving in grass cover, and or leaving an alternate row. So there's really 3 treatments: solid grass cover, like in the picture here, alternate row tilling, which this happens to be during the dormant period, so we do have some growth there, it's not been tilled yet, and alternate tilling. So those 3 treatments were compared. We did include a crop level study in the middle of that trial to see whether crop level or vine vigor had a greater impact on quality, and basically it was the vine vigor, not the crop level or yield level, that influenced quality more. And so we basically found that we were able to decrease vine leaf area by about 40% by having grass between our alleyways. Now I should mention we did have the under vine clear. It was a very small space. It was only about 12 to 15 inches of space that was left free of weeds, and that was either done through herbicides or mechanical tillage, depending on the year. The vineyard manager switched it up, but basically reduced the vine canopy size by about 40%. We had a 69% reduction in lateral shoot growth, and we had a 3-fold increase in sunlight exposure into the canopy. And how did this change occur? Well, many people thought it's water competition of the grass with the vines. Others thought it was nutrient competition. Some thought it was a phytotoxicity of the grass with the vines, but it actually was reduced nitrogen. We did not add any nutrition to this vineyard over time, other than a foliar boron, because we have traditionally very low boron levels. We basically have a lot of nitrogen that cycles in our soils each year, and we basically allowed that grass cover to consume that nitrogen from the soil, and we had enough to keep nice green canopies like this one here. It's actually the grass treatment that's in this picture here, but we did decrease overall vine size during that time, and we could see it in our tissue nitrogen levels. We never got to a point of deficiency. We did just have lower concentrations of nitrogen. And so here is a picture of the year 9 after this vineyard has been in that project for that long. All of these treatments had the same treatments each year. There's the tilled in the background, the grass in the foreground. And if you look closely at the hedge height, which I've outlined here, you can see where the till basically grew more vigorously, filled the hedge box and had to be hedged, whereas the grass really didn't grow beyond it and really was not hedged. Didn't grow into a point where it needed to be hedged, but it still was a nice green canopy. We still had adequate growth. We did have a small reduction in yield, but it wasn't a huge reduction, and it still required crop thinning to meet the target yields. So it wasn't below our production target, essentially. But we did essentially reduce the amount of hedging required, reduce the amount of leaf removal required, and thinning if we were to expand it to a larger percentage of the acreage, which this vineyard manager actually did to the rest of about 150 acres of this vineyard, and helped overall decrease growth and management costs of their vineyard. So it is a powerful tool, and I saw in some of Duncan's pictures that it looks like you guys are using a lot of vineyard floor cover, and that's probably one of the best ways to try to reduce vigor. And what we found is using grasses rather than legumes, which can put a lot more nitrogen into the system. And it will take a couple of years. In this study, we saw the biggest effect after year 3. But pruning weights were affected after year 1, but fruit compositional differences didn't occur until later. And one of the one caveats is that our YANs started to fall, our fruit nitrogen started to fall pretty low, but we never had stuck fermentations from the wine that was produced from the studies. And usually we found an improvement in overall aroma compounds and color in the grass treatment as well, probably due to better light exposure of the canopies. So I turned it over to Duncan for any comments that he wants to share on vineyard floor practices or vigor management.
Duncan, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Right, let me just share my screen for the last slide. Okay. Well, before I go any further, interesting what Patty was saying about the reduction in nitrogen, and again, that concurs exactly with our understanding. One figure that I have seen in the past is that cultivating every alleyway in the vineyard is the equivalent to applying 100 kilograms to the hectare of nitrogen, of actual N. And so it's that mineralization of nitrogen that will be immediately made available to the grapevines. And so by not cultivating the soil, you're preventing that mineralization of nitrogen. And a lot of the soils that we have in the UK, certainly parts of East Sussex, parts of Kent, parts of Essex, they are quite clay-rich soils. They're heavy soils with flat platelets, and they'll mineralize an awful lot of nitrogen if they're cultivated. So yeah, this is certainly something that we look to stay away from, exactly as Patty had said, with the aim of avoiding excessive vine vigor. So what do? One thing that we started doing before plantation now is reducing the in-row vine spacing. Again, with the knowledge that we're going to look to grow ripe fruit, higher quality fruit, coming down to 90 centimeters in certain circumstances. Most of the vineyards that we plant these days are at about 1 meter, but in some cases we'll go down to 90 centimeters. Planted a vineyard this year down to 80 centimeters, and we'll be very interested to see any competition that's generated there and to see how that affects the vine vigor in the years to come. But other methods that we would use to avoid excessive vigor is not using any nitrogen fertilizer, with one exception, which would be slow release organic nitrogen in products like pelleted compost. But that's the nitrate nitrogen has therefore been burned off during the composting process, so there isn't any quick release nitrogen. When I came back to the UK in 2006, the biggest issue was yield. It was the problem with English vineyards was that they didn't produce enough yield. We were down at a ton and a half to the acre, and it was the situation was that many vineyards, they weren't financially viable. And so for my first few years back here, we were very busy putting urea down under the vines in the early spring. We were busy spraying urea and other nitrogen fertilizers on the canopy, during the growing season, and it had the desired effect because the yields were huge, and they went up to 5-6 tons to the acre. The only problem we had with that was that there was so much nitrogen in the plant that we were losing, in some cases, up to 25-30% of the fruit at harvest time, because there was just too much vigor within the vines as a result of the nitrogen that they had been given. We therefore had very thin berry skins which were still expanding and cracking. So again, we learned the hard way, but we now put no nitrogen fertilizer onto our vines either via soil fertilizer or foliar fertilizer. And foliar feeding, again, is something that we have done less and less of over the previous few years. We used to spray lots of nitrogen, lots of potassium. We used to take leaf PTL analysis between each spray round and get an analysis done and see which trace elements were below optimum. And before each spray round, we would then spray individual trace element foliar sprays. So in some of our spray mixtures, we'd have magnesium, we'd have potassium, we'd have zinc, we'd have boron, and eventually we stopped doing this. And all we put in now as a foliar fertilizer on the vineyards, which I'm responsible for, is seaweed extract. And we have not ever seen a problem with deficiency symptoms. I believe that the vine nutrition status has a lot more to do with the level of pruning that's done, with soil management in terms of soil structure, drainage, organic matter composite, organic matter content of the soil. And it is my opinion that a number of English vineyards are putting on too much foliar fertilizer, and this is causing a problem with excessive growth and luxury status of certain nutrients. And as I say, we have found, since we have stopped doing that we have had much better canopy balance. One other thing that we do is we leave our canopy trimming as late as we possibly can. So absolutely not before or during flowering, which I think is a standard practice. For most vine growers, no one trims until flowering is through, but we leave it as late as we dare, and that would be the stage at which the shoots have grown above the height of the trellis posts, just before they're about to tip over under their own weight. That is when we will go and do our canopy trimming. And what we have found is the later we trim, the less we get a lot less lateral growth. So if we trim in the week to 10 days post pollination, we'll get a lot of lateral growth generally. But if we can leave it for a further fortnight, then the size of the laterals and the number of the laterals will be greatly reduced. And part of this is grapevines have a number of hormones, and obviously that they have an apical meristem, which means that the shoots grow from the tip. There's a growth hormone in the tip called auxin. And that is what enables the vine to grow from the tip. If you remove the growing tip, then the auxin hormone in that tip will be redirected, and it goes back down the shoot and out to the nearest growing points. And as it goes down the shoot, those nearest growing points are the laterals in the bud system and in the grapes themselves. So if we are trimming too soon after pollination, that also gives us a problem with excessive compaction, because the berries increase in size. So that's been a key for us. But we will trim 2 times a year, generally not more. We'll trim twice a year, and the first one will be as late as possible. And the last point I'd like to make, again, concurs with what Patty was saying, keeping a green alleyway, but also trying to allow the undervine strip to green up for the second half of the growing season. Now, in the last few years, we have moved away from herbicide, and we use undervine tillage, undervine cultivators, whether that be a serrated disc or a roller hacker or a finger weeder. Now, these tools are very good at eliminating the weeds, but what they also do is they seal moisture in the lower part of the soil profile, and in cultivating, they also mineralize nitrogen. Now, I have seen studies that say undervine cultivation immediately post-flowering improves yeast available nitrogen levels in the grapes at harvest time. And it kind of makes sense because you're mineralizing nitrogen at a time when the berries are expanding. But and it was interesting that Patty had observed slightly lower YAN levels where you had a grass growing in the vineyard alleyway. As I say, where we've identified vineyards which we would like to leave as late as possible for our harvest date, we have found that we get much lower pressure from botrytis and other bunch rots where we allow a little bit of weed growth or grass growth in that undervine strip. And what it also does, it brings about the onset of leaf senescence slightly earlier. And I have a theory, which I have had validated by various different people, that once the vine starts to go into senescence, it will also start to metabolize some of the acid in the grape berries. So if we have leaves which are starting to yellow slightly, and I'll show you that in this is my last slide, this is taken in 2019, you can see that we've allowed the undervine strip to green up. We've got a slight onset, not quite of senescence, but the leaves are starting to go pale. That picture was taken on the 20th of October in 2019, after we had had 35 mil of rain in September and another 20 mil in October. And as you can see, we've got a nice thin canopy there. We've got gently yellowing leaves, and we've got fruit, Chardonnay, clone 95 in that picture there, which is completely free of any botrytis bunch rot. Last botrytis fungicide application on the last day of July. And I will say that the health of those grapes has largely been down to allowing a greening up of the vineyard floor, no nitrogen fertilizer, and early leaf stripping in the fruit zone. So I think that particular picture there is a good example of what can be achieved even in a poor year. 2019, I would say, was one of the poorer years for ripening in the UK. Okay, that's the end of my presentation, so I shall stop sharing and hand back over to Patty.
So basically at this point, I was going to leave it up to the Q&A. Hopefully we still have time. I know we've gone an hour in, or an hour and 12 minutes in. So Joe, I'll let you start out with questions if we are able.
Well, many thanks. We'll move on to our Q&A, and thank you both for your presentations. We have a few things that have come in. The one that came in beforehand, I will fire at you first. So in newly planted vineyards in their third season, do you advise removing inflorescences or newly formed tiny fruit clusters, or to let them crop? And there was an addition to this, might the answer depend on vine vigor? So that's to either of you who'd like to answer.
Patty, would you like to make a comment on that?
Sure. We typically recommend that growers remove the fruit in the first year or two, and then go to about a half crop in year 3, just so that you can start to have some fruit. Even for our vineyards where we have a lot of vigor, it's best to put that energy towards developing a good root system in those first 2 years.
Yeah, I have an answer to that one as well. In the third year is when we would also generally look to taking a crop. But what we do is slightly different to what a number of other growers do. We, at the end of the second winter, we don't lay down a horizontal fruiting cane. We form a trunk. So we cut the vine at the height of the fruiting wire. So let's say 90 centimeters. And during the third growing season, we allow the top 4 or 5 shoots to grow, and we'll take a crop from them. And that will be just under a ton an acre. And what we get a very, very good balance of yield versus shoot production for the following year. So my take for year 3 is that we're growing a small crop, but we're also growing our fruit bearing wood for the next year. And I have seen in English vineyards too often, for the third growing season, people lay down quite a long horizontal fruiting cane on the wire, and you get a lot of growth at the end of the cane, but you don't get the fruit bearing wood growing in the correct location for the following year's crop. And that's why we don't lay a fruiting cane down now in year 3. We just grow from a trunk.
Thank you, Duncan. Next question is, so with leaf stripping, as the grapes are more visible to pests, in particular birds and wasps, have you noticed a greater loss to these pests after stripping? Duncan, in a practical sense.
The answer to that would have to be yes. Yeah, we have. And last year we started for the first time putting nets over the fruit zone. And we used a net. It was a bird net and an insect net. So it did 2 in 1. And the results were very, very good. And the damage to the fruit on the unprotected grapes was far, far higher. And not just the loss of berries, but it's when a bird pecks at a grape berry and the skin of that berry is then broken, you then get bunch rot, and you can start to get sour rot as well if you're not careful. And where we've been trying to leave our grapes on the vine for longer, it's become more and more of a problem. So yes, and certainly I'd actually say it's the same for red grapes and white grapes. We get the same problems in Chardonnay. So yeah, bird netting we found last year was a very, very effective solution to that.
Thank you, Duncan. Patty, have you any view?
We usually don't have too much of a bird issue, which is surprising because we are surrounded by forests. We must have other food for them to eat, but basically we've not seen any additional disease or insect pressures unless it was done too late. And so similar to what Duncan was saying, once you have any sort of damaged berries, that's when it becomes an attractant to other things, wasps included. So we had some issues just recently. Last year, people weren't pulling leaves early enough. They did get breakage of their berries, and then that led to more fruit flies coming in. We normally don't have a fruit fly issue, but that may have been due to ill timing of their leafing, not because they leafed. So I don't think that we've seen any more issues with that.
Do we have time for one more quick question? We're now 1:15. One quick question. Have you seen any difference with bud fruitfulness and early leaf stripping from different pruning methods, i.e. Guillot versus spur cordon?
So I just did a series of studies on that. And the fruitfulness was that's a big question. A lot of growers in Oregon thought that early season leafing would lead to poor fruitfulness. We did end up looking at that, and it turns out that we did not have any impact on bud fruitfulness if we did a full cluster zone leaf removal. And that was really great to see that we weren't having that influence. Mostly we're cane pruned here, so most of our buds would be along a higher part of the cane anyway, that we wouldn't be removing all of those. We also did a cane versus spur pruning trial in 2017 to 2019, and we just published some of that work. Or is it published yet? Yeah, it's published now. The fruitfulness was not lower in spur prunes. So we could get the same amount of yields. We took it from bud fruitfulness to harvest yields. I think that paper just came out earlier this month. And basically we did not reduce fruitfulness at all. And that was our #1 reason in Pinot Noir to go with cane pruning, was every grower had said, we cannot spur prune, otherwise we will have no fruit. And they were terrified to do it. But we found that to not be true. We could actually get good yields, good cluster size. The cluster size is a little bit smaller, but that to many growers is a benefit with the spur pruning.
Duncan, do you have answers to that, or should I just do the last question?
Very, very briefly, I do. Yeah, we've run informal trials over the last few years in 2 vineyards on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. We've been surprised at Chardonnay that it's very, very clone dependent. We have found it's clone dependent. The Chardonnay that we have spur pruned produced more fruit than we had expected. I was slightly concerned about an increased store of carbohydrates leading to better pollination and therefore more compact grape bunches. But that was my theory, and gladly I was proven wrong. We're in the first year of a 3-year trial on an Essex vineyard over spur pruning versus cane pruning. And what we have seen in 2 of the 3 Pinot Noir clones this spring is surprisingly very, very low fruitfulness in the spur prune vines. But I think my theory is, and my feeling is, the grapevines will take 2 or 3 years to possibly react to the change in pruning style. And I'd like to think that after 3, 4, 5 years, that the yield will come back into balance.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because when we did our cane versus spur trial, we made sure that the spurs had been already established. It was actually year 3 when we started the project.
Ah, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so I honestly don't know what it was in years 1 and 2, but it must have been good enough, because it's a commercial vineyard, and the grower, so it was all spur pruned, and then we went in and went back to cane pruning for the comparison. And the grower, that same sort of question has come up from growers here, is that they feel like they would have a lot of variability, and that was always their question, is how old are the spurs? And so we went into it knowing, okay, well, these are already established spurs in year 3. So
yeah, well, it's definitely something we're going to look at more in the UK. Certainly in the vineyards we look after, we're going to look at it more, because I think you get better shoot position as well. The shoots will grow more vertically. We find certain clones, particularly of Pinot Noir, have a tendency to slump unless you spend a lot of money on shoot positioning. And I think that spur pruning can certainly, it could get around that problem.
definitely, we found that to be true with cane. It's just kind of, they all go like this.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you both. One last quick question, because we're getting towards 7:30. When leaf stripping, how many leaves do you need to maintain energy on the shoot for the bunch? Is the age of the leaves also important, i.e. are larger, older leaves or younger, newer leaves best to remove, or just those covering bunches?
So based on, I get that question a lot from growers and wanting to know how much they should maintain. And I think we don't, from a research perspective, have a good guideline for how many leaves you need to have. But I like to reverse it, because we don't know exactly, reverse it to a point to say, if your vine is vigorous and has a lot of density, then you're probably not going to be at a deficit for canopy leaf area. And those are the situations where you want to do leaf removal. So if you can't see through your canopy, then that's a good candidate for leaf removal, and you wouldn't have to worry about taking off too much, especially in cool climates.
I would agree with that. Yeah, we leaf strip really quite aggressively sometimes up to the first pair of foliage wires. And to look at it, it looks extremely aggressive. I read a study in a German wine growing magazine just last week, which found that treatment, 100% leaf stripping in the fruit zone at pollination, it had a 20% reduction in yield, but it gave the best result for sugar accumulation and fruit ripeness by harvest time, versus various other methods of yield reduction, such as spraying gibberellic acid, cutting bunches in half, and things like that. So I think it's surprising how much leaf you can take off without having a detrimental effect and slowing down the phenological growth stages of the grapevine.
I agree.
Joe, you're on silent.
Thank you, Duncan. So easily done.
Yeah.
So before I close this webinar, I would just like to thank everybody for attending, and also, of course, our speakers. That was brilliant. Thank you very much to Patty and to Duncan. And just to say that this webinar recording will be available in a few days' time on the WineGB website. And in 2 weeks' time, we will be focusing on vine nutrition. So I'll close this webinar now, and thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
It's a
you.
pleasure.